Welcome back to the channel. Today's spotlight is authentication feature. Let's go ahead and create this feature. As usual, under File, New, Module, choose Android library. I'm gonna call it authentication feature. And I would like to add to here, first of all, the domain layer. Copy this, paste it here as a namespace or package, and hit finish. You're gonna end up with an error. As usual, I'm going to delete the stall lines. They are added automatically by Android Studio. Switch to project. Under authentication feature, hit Gradle. I'm going to delete this, of course, dependencies. We will use Android library as well as Kotlin Android. We need to apply this shared Gradle plugin. For the dependencies, we need core from core module as well as health for dependency injection. After doing this, sync the project or sync the module. Switch back to Android, and under build source, I would like to add the same thing that we have done here under the feature library. Create a new file, call it authentication feature dependencies. Let's add the implementation for the domain layer. For testing purposes, let's add the Android tests implementation for the data layer and the implementation for the entire feature. And the authentication, create here, as usual, a new package. So under domain, it will be repository and another package for use cases. And the repository creates a new interface authentication repository. We know already the method that we're going to implement here. We have to define the login function. We're going to use here caching, or in other words, we're going to synchronize between cache, aka room database, and the data from API call. The definition here, instead of a suspension function, it will be given us as a return type, a flow of user. The next function, register function, we have to provide full name, email, password confirmation as a return type, just a normal string as we have done previously under API of Laravel. The next function is get authenticated user, a flow of resource. It's going to give us flow of resource and user. It has to be nullable. And because we're going to handle or to simulate the principle of session under our Kotlin application, we need to get the authenticated user from the cache. Basically, we're going to check if we have already a defined or a cached authenticated user. We can say here in this case that we have a cached authenticated user. Therefore, let's go ahead and define get authenticated user. That's going to give us a flow of user. It has to be nullable because perhaps the user does exist under caching, perhaps not. And the text in parameter, a user ID of type long. And the logout function, it is a suspending function that takes in parameter user ID of type long and give us a boolean whether the user is logged out or not. And after logging out the user, we have to clear the cache. Therefore, going to, as suggested here by Android Studio, suspending function, clear cache. That's pretty much it for the definition. For the use cases, I don't think it's necessary to go in detail how to create use cases. With the same thing that we have done under the product feature, we need to override for each case the operator invoke. I'm going to provide the list or the available use cases for this particular feature. As an overview, let's take, for example, the login or the logout use case. We're going to inject in the constructor the repository, which is the main reason why we are doing the domain layer. And we have to override the operator invoke in order to make this class or the instance of this class invocable. I have gathered all the use cases under one data class in order to make it easier for us to inject and to provide the dependencies or to show health how to inject those use cases to be used in the view model easily. Let's go ahead and implement this particular domain layer. Under authentication feature, create a new module, Android library, data, copy this one, paste it here, and you are good to go. Let's remove these two lines that Android Studio is going to add. Switch to project, authentication feature. We have the data here. Delete this as well, and the dependencies that we're going to define. As usual, we're going to use Android library and Kotlin Android. Let's apply the shared Gradle plugin. For the dependencies, we need core as usual and health and room database. If you are just not sure about how to write the plugins that we have defined at this particular stage, you are safe to sync the project. Let's go ahead and sync the project in order to benefit from the autocomplete. And we can sync again once we are done defining or adding the dependencies for this particular feature. Switch to Android. As I said before, we need room database. The data module Android test implementation for testing purposes, because we are going to write integration tests for this repository implementation. Pass the project. The last one, which is we need again the authentication feature domain in order to access the repository interface. That's pretty much it. Now you can sync again the project. And we are done with the definition of this domain layer. Under data, create a new package, let's call it repository. Inside, create a new class, let's call it authentication repository implementation. As I said before, we are going to deal with caching, therefore we have to inject into constructor database as well as the API service, and we have to protect and secure our API token. Therefore, we need three dependencies. The first one, database, API service, and crypto service. Add annotation inject, and we have to implement authentication repository. I want to just get rid of all the DAOs that we will need basically in this implementation. We need user DAO, wishlist, products, and image. For the implementation of login, we're going to synchronize what we have in the remote database and the caching. And I want to return here a single source of truth that has to be the database. Basically, we're going to make an API call, cache the data, and return a single flow representing a stream of data. Let's make the API call, store it under response. In parameter, we need to return a response of type login response DTO. We have to provide here the form data of type map, string, and string. For the URL, basically is login. For the body, which is basically the form data, we have to provide the email and password. For the headers, we have to set the content type form URL encoded. Underneath, we need to secure the token because we have right now from the response, the user as well as the token. We need to secure the token. Therefore, I'm going to store the secured token under this token value, and we have to call crypto service encrypt, and the data basically is the response and token. The user will be response user, and the wishlist, just to make our life easier, user and wishlist. Now I'm going to proceed by caching the data. First of all, I'm going to delete all the related wishlists for this particular user, and we have to provide here the user ID, which is user ID. Now we have to cache the data of the wishlist for each. Let's name this one item, for example. From the item representing the wishlist, we can access the product detail, which is nullable. Let's apply to it the let's copy function to product DTO, and we can access from the product DTO the list of images under media. Let's name this parameter image DTO. For each image, we're going to insert the image. Perhaps here I have done modal ID. You can just do model ID. I have just refactored the parameter and rename it to actually model ID because it was modal ID. And we have to provide here the model ID, which is basically product DTO and ID. The order here matters. We need to cache first of all the images, so the relationship won't fail retrieving the related data. Underneath, we're going to insert product entity. So right now we are done with caching the list of products with the related images. We need to insert right now each wishlist item. Basically, it has to be renamed to more readable option, which is insert wishlist item, but it doesn't matter. And we have to provide here the user ID. Let's fold this section. After caching the wishlist, we're going to cache the data of the user. And we have to provide here the token, which is encrypted token. Now we are done with caching the data. We need to emit some values to the function. Basically, what we want to do here is we need to emit one single source of truth that's going to be served as the source of data. I'm going just to comment here this section to do, and we have to surround this whole thing with try catch, exception of type exception. We will throw exception. Let's remove this particular one because we're going right now to emit all the data needed. As I said before, it's going to be from the DAO or from the database, and we have to convert the whole thing to a user data. Therefore, we're going to use the emit function or the emit all function. The flow here, which is basically user DAO, get cached user with wishlist, and we have to provide here as an argument user ID. We have to map the whole thing it to user. And because it's nullable, we need to add here the null safety operator to user. If it's not going to emit the conversion of the user DTO to user. Perhaps for readability purposes, I'm just gonna name this one to user DTO. If this data from database is null, we're going to emit user DTO to user. I think this one is not nullable. I'm going to, because it has to be nullable. That's pretty much it for the user or login function. The other function, which is register. Let's wrap the whole thing with try catch. Gonna throw exception here. This simply will return API response, and the method here is a put method. The URL is register. We need to provide name, email, password, and password confirmation. It has to be the same thing as the Laravel key. For the headers, content type to form URL encoded. And that's all we have for the register function. Let's implement the other one, which is get authenticated user. This will return flow. First of all, going to emit resource of type loading, because right now we're going to hit the API call, cache the data, and return or emit the cached user from the database. Let's wrap the whole thing with try catch. We're gonna come back to this block later on. Let's focus on the try. We need to make sure that we have the valid token in order to get this token and make with it API calls. Let's come back to the user DAO. Let's add here one function that's going to get the latest cached user. This method is going to allow us to get the latest cached user regardless of the current user, and it has to be nullable. Now we can get the latest cached user first emission. If the cached user is null, we're going to emit a resource of type error. There is no user found, or there is no cached user, and it has to be of type API error. Underneath, we're going to return the flow. Basically, we're going to end the flow. This is basically an early return. We know for sure that we have a cached user. Therefore, we can decrypt the token. Let's store it under decrypted token, crypto service, and we have to apply decrypt, and we can access the token. Now we have the decrypted token. We can safely and easily make the API call user is authenticated, which is the API call that needs a token or a bearer token in order to perform. Let's store this result in a value, call it user. It's gonna give us a user DTO. Let's provide the URL. And if you do remember, under the Laravel API section, this API endpoint is protected by Sanctum. In other words, we have to provide a bearer token. We have to provide the authorization and assigning the bearer token. And we have our user DTO. If this method fails, it's going to throw an exception. And here we're going to basically emit another resource of type error, telling the user we have an error authenticating. Now we're going to proceed with caching the data. Let's store the wishlist for this particular user. Let's call it wishlist. As we have done before, we're going to delete the entire wishlist. We're going to cache the data of the wishlist, aka the product with its related image, and insert the product. And we can cache the user wishlist. Underneath, we're going to do wishlist DAO, insert wishlist. Next, we have to insert the data or the new data of this particular user. You have two options, whether to pass the cached token or the new token from the API call. At the end, we're going to emit all the values as we have done previously. And because this value is nullable, we can do here, for example, user DTO to user. If it fails to get for some reason the list of data under the emitted result, we're going to get the user DTO from the call or the API call. If we have a problem, we're just going to emit a resource of type error. That's pretty much it for this function. Let's get the cached authenticated user. It will return user DAO, get cached user wishlist. We have to provide here the user ID, and we have to map the result. And because it's nullable, we need a nullable value here. So we're not going to return a default value. For the logout, it is a suspending function, no flow to deal with. Let's run the whole thing with try catch as usual. First of all, we're going to check if we have already an cached user. If there is no particular cached user, we don't have to call the logout function. And in order to make the API call logout, we need to have the token. Basically, we're going to decrypt the token. Because now we have the cached user, we can safely access the token from the database. Next, Let's make our API call. If the token is valid, it's going to log out the user. Otherwise, it's going to throw an error. Now we have logged out the user using the API endpoint or the API call. We have to clear the storage. Finally, we'll return the response. If we have an error, throw only the exception. For a production application, you have to make a user-friendly error handling, if you will. The last one, which is to clear the cached user. If we have a cached user, then we can clear the cache. Otherwise, there is no need to do so. That's pretty much it for the authenticated user repository. Now let's define the DI module. Under data, create a new package, call it DI, authentication feature domain module. And we have to show Health how to provide the repository as well as the use cases. Let's show Health how to provide the instance of authentication use case. And in my opinion, by far, this is the best library to handle dependency injection. And we are done basically with our implementation. Now it's time to make our integration test. Under Kotlin, Android, make sure to choose this one, written between parentheses Android test, package repository. Since the repository implementation resides under the repository implementation or the repository package, a new class, let's call it authentication repository implementation test. Let's provide the mock API service, crypto service, repository, and the DAOs to test if the database has the correct and related data. Next, we need to make some initialization here under the setup function. We need to create the context, and we can have our instance of mock database. Now we have to provide the rest, mock API service, the mock crypto, and the repository and user DAO. The first step that we have to do is we need to make sure that the login should authenticate user and get the correct user data. Let's arrange. Basically, we're going to assign an email and a password. Next, we're going to act. Basically, we're going to call repository and login. Let's provide the email and password. And since this function will give a flow, we're going to use turbine test. Basically, this function is going to give one simple flow, which is the user. Let's call it user. Let's await the first emission. We're going to make sure that this user is not null. And we have to make sure that the user equal the mock data and the response. And we need to make sure that we have the correct data from the database. To do so, I'm going to call here a value cached user, get latest cached user, or you can just do get cached user with wishlist. In this case, we have to provide the user and ID. I think it's safe to say after the assertion that the user is not null, we're going to access this particular cached user. And for the assertion, we have to call here, I forgot to do here first, cached user, and we have to make sure here to do cached user. And because it's nullable, first of all, I'm going to add another assertion. I'm going to assert that the cached user data is not null, assert equal user and cached user to user. Basically, this mapper function is going to give us a user and its wishlist. Let's run our test. And the test passed. That's very good. Now we are 100% sure that the function login is going to perform an API call, cache the data, and the data that's going to be cached are basically the same data as the data from the API call. Now let's write the other function. After giving the wrong credentials, we must have an error. Let's give here some random wrong credentials. Then we have to act. If there is any error, it's going to throw this particular exception. Therefore, we're going to call here the function catch, defined under the flow, catches exceptions in the flow. The specific action here, we're going to assert that we have an error of type API error. Let's rename this parameter to error, assert true, error is API error. Let's test this function. And the test passed. Basically, our login function will give us an error if the wrong credentials are provided. Let's take, for example, the get authenticated user. Let's make sure that the function get authenticated user should get the current authenticated user. Let's arrange. First of all, to make sure that we have already predefined authenticated user, let's insert some data. Now we have to act. Let's do repository, get authenticated user. Let's handle the loading state as usual. If you do remember, let's come back to the authentication repository. the first emission should be loading. So we're going to make sure that we are under the first emission, which is resource of type loading. That's what we have done here. Afterward, we are expecting a success state. Now we have the success state data. We need to make sure that the authenticated user data matches the data from the response. Let's make sure that this is not a null value. We need to make sure that the authenticated user is the same as API response. And I have done this particular function in order to simulate various scenarios. Going to do here true. We can access here the data to user. Underneath, we're going to cancel and ignore remaining events. Let's run the test. And the test passed, which is great. Now for the other case or the other scenario, get authenticated user should get no user after passing or after wrong token, which is very important. To simulate this, we need to provide a wrong token. Let's call it some wrong token. For example, with the same manner, let's insert some user to test with and let's act. The first state, which is loading state, we need to make sure we are under loading state. And the other state, which is the error state, we need to assert that we are under error state and we have to cancel and ignore the remaining events. That's basically the test. And before running the test, we have to use the wrong token. Instead of this one, we're going to assign it here, wrong token. Now we are good to go. Let's run the test. Now we are 100% sure whenever we are going to pass a wrong token, the get authenticated user is going to give us an error of type API error. The other function that we have to test is logout. Let's arrange and let's insert a data, because under authentication repository implementation, before running the function logout, we need to make sure that we have already a cached user in order to get the correct token, and we have to act. Let's store the response in a value, call it logout response, repository, and logout. And we have to provide the user ID. For the first assertion, we need to make sure that the logout response is set to true, because the logout return a boolean. And we need to make sure that the data are completely wiped out from the database. Assert null. Let's access the cached user by doing user.dal, get latest cached user, and the first emission. That's pretty much it. Let's run the test. And the logout function works as expected. The last test case here is we need to make sure that the logout function should not log out the user or the current user after providing wrong token. Let's arrange wrong token and the user DTO that we're gonna use and insert this particular user DTO. And again, to simulate this scenario, we have to provide the wrong token or to cache the wrong token instead of the correct one. Now let's act. Let's run this block with try catch. We need to make sure that we have an error of API error. For the acting, we're going to do here repository, logout, and we have to pass the user ID, which is user and ID. Exception, assert true, exception is API error. So let's come back to the implementation. We have here get method. And for the get method, if we have a problem, if we don't have a success state, we're going to throw an API error. For the rest of the exceptions, we're not going to use client request exception or server response exception. To all cases, we're going to handle the exceptions under one single exception. That's going to be our custom exception API error. That's why under the test, I want to make sure that we have an exception of type API error to make sure that we have the correct exception. Let's run the test. And the test passed. Let's go ahead and run all the tests. That's perfect. We have all the tests passed with green flying color. That's going to wrap up the first part of this authentication feature. For the next tutorial, we're going to build the presentation layer and we're going to make our integration test for the view model. I hope you have learned something new. See you in the next one and happy coding.